A dying veteran left a homeless Navy SEAL a forgotten hangar, but his dog uncovered a secret meant only for him. The day Mason Hale buried the only man who still believed in him, he thought he was losing the last connection to his past. Homeless, haunted by war, and living from an aging pickup truck with his loyal German Shepherd Atlas, Mason expected nothing from the future. But deep in the Montana mountains, behind the rusted doors of a forgotten military hangar, Atlas began searching for something no one else could see. A secret hidden for decades, and a final wish powerful enough to change Mason's life forever. Comment 1 or 0 and tell us where you're watching from. The wind carried the smell of pine and distant snow across the Bitterroot Valley as Mason Hale sat on the tailgate of his aging pickup truck, staring at a church he never thought he'd enter again. Beside him, Atlas rested on the cold gravel. The German Shepherd's silver-flecked muzzle showed his age now. His ears were still sharp, but his movements had slowed over the years. He watched every passing car, every shifting shadow, every stranger who came near Mason. Some habits never left a working dog. Some scars never left a Navy SEAL. The church bell rang once, then again. The sound echoed across the small Montana town like a farewell. Inside, people were saying goodbye to Raymond Bishop. Outside, Mason couldn't bring himself to move. Funerals had always been hard. Too many memories. Too many names. Too many ghosts. A flash of sound cracked through his mind. Gunfire. Radio chatter. The smell of burning diesel. Mason blinked hard and looked down at the gravel. The memory vanished. Atlas immediately lifted his head. The dog pressed his nose against Mason's hand, grounding him, pulling him back, the same way he'd done 100 times before. "I'm all right, buddy," Mason said quietly. Atlas didn't seem convinced. Neither was Mason. At 42 years old, Mason Hale had survived places most people only saw in movies. Afghanistan, Syria, operations that never appeared in newspapers, missions that officially never happened. He had returned home with medals stored in boxes nobody ever looked at, and a mind that never fully came home. The nightmares came almost every night. Crowded rooms made his chest tighten. Fireworks felt like incoming rounds. Most employers didn't want someone who startled at sudden noises and slept in his truck. So Mason drifted. A little work here, a little work there. Repairing fences, fixing generators, changing brakes. Whatever paid enough for fuel and dog food. The only constant in his life was Atlas. The retired military working dog had been beside him during the worst day of his life. The day their team never came home whole. Since then, they belonged to each other. The church doors opened. People slowly began filing outside. Men in work jackets, women carrying tissues, old ranchers with weathered faces. Most glanced at Mason. Some nodded politely. Others looked away. A few whispered. He was used to it. The homeless veteran. The guy living in a pickup. The town's reminder that not every hero got a happy ending. Atlas stood first. His attention locked onto someone approaching. An older woman with gray hair and a black coat. Attorney Linda Carver, Raymond's lawyer. She stopped in front of Mason. "Mason." He stood. "Ma'am." Her expression softened. "He thought highly of you." Mason swallowed. "So did I." The words felt heavier than he expected, because they were true. For nearly 4 years, Raymond Bishop had been the only person in town who never treated him like a problem. Every Tuesday morning, same booth, same diner, same coffee. The old Korean War veteran would sit across from Mason and talk about engines, weather, fishing, and everything except the war. Sometimes they sat in silence. Strangely, those were the conversations Mason remembered most. "There's something you need to hear," Linda said. Mason frowned. What is it? She glanced toward the church. The reading of the will. Mason looked confused. That doesn't have anything to do with me. Linda's expression suggested otherwise. Actually, it does. An hour later, Mason sat in a small office above the town bank. Atlas lay beside his chair. The dog never took his eyes off the room. The office smelled of old paper and coffee. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Several members of Raymond's extended family occupied the remaining chairs. Most looked irritated. One looked furious. Travis Bishop, Raymond's nephew. A broad-shouldered man in his 50s who owned half the construction equipment in the county. His impatience filled the room. Linda opened a folder. The reading began. A few savings accounts, some investments, personal belongings, family heirlooms. Travis grew more relaxed with every passing minute, clearly expecting the biggest inheritance. Then Linda reached the final page. Her tone changed. The remaining property known as Bishop Airfield, including all structures, equipment, and associated land holdings, is hereby transferred in full to Mason Hale. Silence. Complete silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Travis laughed. A short, disbelieving laugh. What? Linda repeated herself. The silence shattered. That's ridiculous. Travis stood. You're telling me my uncle left that dump to him? He pointed directly at Mason. Mason felt every eye in the room turn toward him. Even he didn't understand. What airfield? He asked. Linda slid a set of brass keys across the desk. Heavy, old, military issue. They belong to the property. Mason stared. The keys looked decades old, preserved, maintained, important. Travis shook his head. You've got to be kidding. No, Linda replied calmly. The will is very clear. The room erupted into arguments. Relatives protested. Questions flew. Voices rose. Through it all, Mason remained silent. He only looked at the keys. Something about them felt deliberate. Like Raymond had expected this moment. Like the old man had known exactly what he was doing. Eventually, the meeting ended. People stormed out. Travis left last. He paused at the doorway. His eyes narrowed. You think you won something today? Mason said nothing. Travis laughed again. Bishop Airfield is a rusted graveyard buried in the mountains. He pointed toward the keys. Congratulations. Then he left. The office fell quiet. Linda sat back. He wasn't always like that. Mason barely heard her. What exactly did Raymond leave me? Linda opened a map. A finger tapped a location deep in the Bitterroot Mountains. An old military hangar. Mason studied the map. Miles from town. Hidden among forest and ridges. Remote. Forgotten. Almost invisible. He owned that. For decades. Why? Linda smiled faintly. That's the question he said you'd ask. Mason looked up. What did he say? Linda hesitated. Then she answered. His exact words were, she opened another note. Mason won't understand at first, but Atlas will. The room suddenly felt colder. Mason glanced at his dog. Atlas was already staring at the map. Completely focused. The lawyer laughed softly. Funny thing. What? Every time Raymond talked about that hangar, he always asked about your dog. Mason frowned. Why? He never explained. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the valley. Clouds rolled over distant peaks. The first hint of a mountain storm gathered on the horizon. Mason stepped into the parking lot. Atlas followed closely. The brass keys felt heavy in his pocket. Too heavy, as though they carried something larger than metal, something Raymond had spent years protecting. The town's diner sat across the street. A few locals were already gathered inside, watching him through the windows. Some laughed. Others shook their heads. Word traveled fast in small towns. The homeless veteran inherited a junkyard. The story would be all over town by morning. Mason started toward his truck. Atlas suddenly stopped. Completely stopped. His ears rose. His body became rigid. Focused. Alert. Mason followed his gaze. The dog wasn't looking at town. He wasn't looking at the diner. He wasn't looking at the mountains. He was staring directly at the map still visible through the lawyer's office window, at the exact location of the hangar. A low sound escaped Atlas's throat. Not a growl, not fear. Recognition. The hairs rose along Mason's arms. Atlas never reacted like that without reason. Never. The dog stepped closer, nudged the truck door, then looked back at Mason, waiting. Almost as if he were saying, "Let's go." Mason looked toward the distant mountains, toward the forgotten airfield, toward the place Raymond Bishop had protected for decades. The storm clouds gathered above the peaks, dark, heavy, watching. And for the first time since the funeral began, Mason felt something he hadn't felt in years. Curiosity. Why would a respected veteran leave everything to a homeless Navy SEAL? And why did Atlas already seem to know the answer? Those questions followed Mason Hale all night. Rain drummed softly against the roof of his pickup truck as it sat parked beside the edge of town. The storm that had threatened the valley finally arrived after midnight, sweeping down from the Bitterroot Mountains in cold gray sheets. Mason slept little. That wasn't unusual. Sleep had become something he borrowed rather than owned. Every time his eyes closed, the same fragments returned. A helicopter, a radio screaming for help, dust and smoke, a teammate calling his name. Then silence. His eyes snapped open. The truck cab was dark. His breathing was shallow. For a moment he didn't know where he was. Afghanistan, Montana, past, present. The lines blurred sometimes. A warm nose touched his hand. Atlas. The German shepherd sat beside him in the darkness, waiting, grounding him, just as he always did. Mason rubbed the dog's neck. "You never quit on me, do you?" Atlas leaned closer. Outside, thunder rolled through the mountains. The old dog finally settled back onto his blanket. But he didn't sleep. His eyes remained fixed toward the windshield, toward the direction of the mountains, toward the place Raymond Bishop had left behind. The next morning arrived cold and silver. Fresh snow dusted the higher peaks. Clouds clung to the ridges like torn cotton. By sunrise, Mason was already fueling the truck. The brass keys sat on the dashboard, heavy, silent, waiting. He wasn't entirely sure why he was going. Curiosity, maybe. Respect for Raymond. Or perhaps because there was nowhere else to be. Atlas jumped into the passenger seat before Mason even opened the door for him. That alone felt strange. The dog usually waited for a command. Today, he didn't. Mason started the engine. The truck growled to life, and together they headed west. The town disappeared behind them. Civilization slowly gave way to wilderness. The highway narrowed into winding mountain roads. Pine forests stretched endlessly across the slopes. Rivers cut through valleys carved by centuries of snowmelt. The farther they traveled, the fewer signs of human life remained. Mason found himself remembering the first time he met Atlas, 8 years earlier. Virginia. military working dog training facility. Atlas had been younger then, faster, strong as a machine. Most handlers struggled with him. The shepherd trusted nobody, listened to nobody. Until Mason. Nobody could explain why. The bond formed almost immediately. Within weeks, they operated like a single unit. During deployments, teammates often joked that Atlas understood Mason better than people did. The joke turned out to be true. The truck climbed higher into the mountains. The road became rougher. Patches of cracked pavement gave way to gravel, then dirt. Old logging routes twisted through dense forests. Many hadn't been maintained in years. Mason checked the map Linda had given him. Still another 20 miles. Atlas suddenly sat upright. His ears pointed forward. Every muscle in his body tightened. "What is it, buddy?" The dog stared through the windshield, focused, alert. The same expression he used during operations. Mason slowed the truck. Nothing appeared unusual, just trees, snow, mountains. Yet Atlas remained fixed on something, or somewhere. The strange behavior continued for miles. By noon, they reached an abandoned gas station long reclaimed by nature. The building leaned sideways. Broken windows reflected the gray sky. A rusted sign swayed in the wind. Mason parked for a short break. Atlas immediately jumped out. Not to explore, not to stretch. Instead, he stood facing north, toward the deeper mountains, toward the destination. A low whine escaped him. Mason frowned. "You're acting like you've been there before." Atlas glanced back, then returned his attention to the wilderness. The reaction sent a chill through Mason, because Raymond's words suddenly echoed in his memory. Mason won't understand at first, but Atlas will. The old veteran had said it as if he knew something impossible. The road eventually narrowed to little more than 2 tire tracks cutting through dense forest. Towering pines blocked much of the sunlight. The mountain air carried the smell of wet earth and snow. Hours passed. The isolation deepened. No houses, no ranches, no fences. Nothing. Then Mason saw it. Far ahead, through gaps in the trees. A shape. Massive. Impossible to miss once spotted. The truck rounded a bend, and suddenly the entire valley opened before him. Mason stopped breathing. The hangar stood at the center of a wide clearing surrounded by mountains. It looked enormous, like a forgotten fortress abandoned by time. Its curved roof rose above the tree line. Weathered steel reflected the pale afternoon light. Sections showed rust. Others remained strangely intact. A chain-link fence surrounded the property. Most of it had collapsed decades ago. Snow drifted against the outer walls. The place felt frozen in another era. Forgotten. Waiting. Mason parked near the entrance. The engine fell silent. For a moment, neither he nor Atlas moved. Wind swept across the clearing, carrying a strange stillness, the kind found in churches or battlefields, places where history lingered. Then Atlas exploded into motion. The German shepherd leaped from the truck, not with excitement, with purpose. He sprinted directly toward the hangar. Mason jumped out after him. "Atlas!" The dog ignored him. Atlas reached the massive steel doors and stopped. His body became rigid, ears forward, tail still, eyes locked on the structure. Mason had seen that posture before, hundreds of times. Atlas only acted this way when he detected something important, or dangerous. The wind howled across the clearing. The dog slowly approached the doors, then sniffed. Once, twice, 3 times. His behavior changed immediately. He began pacing, circling, searching, almost frantic. "Easy, buddy." Atlas didn't respond. He moved along the wall, back to the doors, then to the wall again, searching, looking, trying to find something. Mason felt unease crawl into his chest. Not fear, instinct. Years of combat had taught him to trust warnings that didn't yet make sense. And right now, Atlas was screaming a warning, or perhaps an invitation. Mason removed the brass keys from his pocket. The metal felt colder than before. One by one, he studied them, each marked with military serial numbers, each carefully maintained, each preserved for decades. The largest key matched the enormous lock hanging from the hangar doors. Mason stepped forward. Snow crunched beneath his boots. The lock was old, yet surprisingly clean, almost as though someone had serviced it recently. That thought made him pause. Nobody had been here. Had they? Atlas suddenly placed himself between Mason and the door, protective, alert. His eyes scanned the surrounding forest, watching, listening, waiting. Mason slowly looked around. The valley remained empty, silent. But the sensation persisted. The feeling that they weren't the first people here, perhaps not even the first that week. The key slid into the lock. Perfect fit. Atlas immediately began whining, softly, urgently. Mason glanced down. The dog wasn't afraid. He was impatient, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. The lock clicked. The sound echoed across the clearing. Deep, metallic, ancient. A flock of birds exploded from nearby trees. Atlas stepped closer, every muscle trembling. Mason wrapped both hands around the cold steel chain. Slowly, he began pulling it free. The massive hangar doors stood before them, sealed for decades, guarding whatever Raymond Bishop had spent a lifetime protecting. And Atlas seemed more determined than ever to get inside. The steel chain slid to the frozen ground with a heavy clang. The sound echoed across the clearing before vanishing into the surrounding mountains. For a moment, everything became still. No birds, no wind, no movement. Just silence. Mason stood facing the enormous hangar doors. Atlas pressed close beside him. The German shepherd's eyes never left the dark seam between the steel panels. His ears remained forward. His body was tense, ready, waiting. Mason wrapped both hands around one of the doors. The metal was cold enough to sting his skin. He pushed. Nothing. The door hadn't moved in years, maybe decades. He planted his boots more firmly, pushed harder. The hinges groaned. A deep metallic sound rolled through the valley. Snow slid from the roof overhead. Atlas immediately stepped forward. The gap widened. A rush of stale air escaped from inside. Cold, dry, ancient. It carried a faint scent Mason couldn't immediately identify. Oil, steel, dust, and something else. Something oddly familiar. Atlas sniffed the air once, then twice. His entire posture changed. The dog wasn't alarmed. He was focused. Mason pulled the door farther open. Gray daylight spilled into the darkness. The interior slowly revealed itself, and Mason froze. He had expected ruin, broken equipment, collapsed roofs, decay. Instead, he found order, perfect order. Rows of tool cabinets stood neatly against one wall. Workbenches remained organized. Storage racks were carefully labeled. Even the concrete floor looked surprisingly clean. Dust covered everything. But nothing appeared abandoned. It looked preserved, like someone had expected to return. Mason stepped inside. His boots echoed across the massive structure. The cavernous space swallowed sound. Atlas remained beside him. The dog moved cautiously, watching, listening. The hangar seemed far larger from the inside. Sunlight streamed through narrow windows high above. Long beams of light cut through floating dust particles. Everywhere Mason looked, he found evidence of care. Military-grade tool sets, maintenance carts, spare parts, shelves stacked with containers. Nothing appeared random. Everything had a place. Everything had a purpose. His eyes settled on a nearby workbench. A thick layer of dust covered its surface. Yet the tools underneath remained perfectly aligned. He ran a finger across the edge. The steel beneath still gleamed. Someone had maintained this place for years, maybe decades. "Raymond," Mason muttered. "What were you doing up here?" Atlas suddenly walked away. The dog headed deeper into the hangar. Mason followed. The farther they moved inside, the stranger the place became. Rows of sealed fuel drums occupied one section, each clearly labeled, each protected from the elements. Nearby stood shelves filled with maintenance manuals, aircraft manuals, engineering manuals, military manuals, thousands of pages, thousands of hours of work. The collection alone would have taken years to assemble. Mason felt a growing sense of unease. Nothing about this made sense. Raymond had lived like an ordinary retired veteran. Quiet, modest, simple. Yet this place suggested something entirely different. Atlas stopped. His eyes locked onto the center of the hangar. Mason followed his gaze, and finally saw it. The shape hidden beneath enormous tarps. His breath caught. The object was massive, far larger than a truck. Long, sleek, its outline unmistakable. An aircraft. A very large aircraft. The heavy canvas coverings concealed most details, but the silhouette was obvious. Mason slowly approached. His footsteps echoed through the building. The closer he got, the more unbelievable it seemed. An entire aircraft, hidden in the mountains, maintained in secret, protected for decades. He reached out, lifted one corner of the tarp, only a few inches. Just enough. A section of dark metal appeared underneath. Smooth, polished, flawless. No rust, no corrosion, no damage. The surface looked almost new. Mason immediately dropped the tarp. His heart was beating faster. This wasn't a forgotten relic. This was something else entirely. Something important. Something expensive. Something Raymond had protected with extraordinary care. A sudden scratching noise broke the silence. Mason turned. Atlas wasn't looking at the aircraft. The dog had crossed the hangar. He stood near the far rear wall, scratching, digging, obsessively. The sound echoed through the building. Claws against concrete. Again. 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 Atlas. The dog ignored him. Mason walked over. The shepherd never took his eyes off the floor. He scratched harder. Dust scattered. The sound grew louder. "What are you doing?" Atlas continued. Focused. Determined. Almost desperate. Mason knelt beside him. The floor looked ordinary. Concrete. Old. Cracked in places. Nothing unusual. Yet Atlas refused to stop. The dog circled once, returned, scratched again, then barked. A single sharp bark, the kind he used during searches. Mason stared. Years of experience told him one thing. Atlas believed something was there, something hidden, something important. The same instinct that had saved lives overseas now pointed directly at a patch of concrete in an abandoned mountain hangar. Mason placed his hand on the floor. cold, solid, nothing obvious. Still, Atlas remained convinced. Eventually, Mason stood. "We'll look later." Atlas looked up at him, clearly dissatisfied. The dog sat beside the spot, refusing to move. Hours passed. Mason continued exploring. He discovered maintenance logs stretching back decades. Every entry written in Raymond's careful handwriting. Dates, repairs, inspections, inventory records, thousands of pages. The deeper he read, the more confused he became. The entries described aircraft maintenance schedules, fuel system checks, engine inspections, communication equipment testing, all meticulously documented. All performed by Raymond alone, for years, for decades. One log entry caught his attention. The date was almost 30 years old. The note was brief. Asset remains secure. Mission preserved. Awaiting the right guardian. Mason read it twice, then a third time. A chill moved through him. Awaiting the right guardian. Not owner, not pilot. Guardian. The same language Linda had hinted at. The same language that felt intentional, personal. As evening approached, sunlight faded from the high windows. Long shadows filled the hangar. The temperature dropped. Mason closed the logbook. Atlas remained exactly where he had started, still guarding the same patch of concrete, still watching, still waiting. Mason walked over once more. The dog immediately stood. Hope flickered in his eyes. Mason examined the floor again, this time more carefully. He noticed something, a faint difference in color, barely visible, a slight variation in texture, as though one section had been poured separately from the rest. Years apart. Most people would never notice, but Atlas had. The shepherd lowered his nose, whined softly, then tapped the spot with one paw. Once, twice, 3 times. Mason slowly looked around the hangar, then back at the aircraft, then back at the floor. For the first time since arriving, a new possibility entered his mind. Maybe the aircraft wasn't the secret. Maybe it was only protecting one. And if Atlas was right, whatever Raymond had spent his life guarding wasn't sitting under a tarp. It was buried beneath their feet. That realization followed Mason Hale all the way back to town. The sun had already disappeared behind the Bitterroot Mountains when he locked the hangar and loaded Atlas into the truck. The German shepherd resisted. For the first time all day, Atlas refused a direct command. He remained beside the strange section of concrete, staring down at it as if abandoning his post would be a mistake. "Come on, buddy." Atlas looked up, then back at the floor. The hesitation lasted only a second, but it was enough to send another chill through Mason. Finally, the dog obeyed. Yet as they drove away, Atlas kept looking through the rear window, watching the hangar disappear into the darkness, watching whatever secret remained hidden there. The mountain roads felt even lonelier after sunset. Headlights cut through tunnels of pine trees. Snow glittered on distant ridges beneath the moonlight. Normally, Mason enjoyed the isolation. Tonight, his mind wouldn't settle. The aircraft, the maintenance logs, the strange phrase, awaiting the right guardian. And most of all, Atlas. The dog had never behaved this way before, not even during combat deployments. By the time they reached town, lights glowed warmly from storefront windows. Life continued as usual. People filled restaurants. Pickup trucks lined Main Street. Ranchers gathered outside the feed store. Yet somehow everything felt different now, as though Mason carried a secret nobody else could see. He parked beside the diner where he and Raymond had shared countless breakfasts. The familiar neon sign buzzed softly. Atlas jumped out first. The dog immediately checked the surroundings. Old habits, always protecting, always working. Inside, the smell of coffee and grilled onions filled the air. Conversations hummed across the room. Several people glanced toward Mason, then whispered. Word had spread. The inheritance was already town gossip. Mason took his usual booth, the one he and Raymond always used. For a moment, looking across the empty seat hurt more than he expected. Raymond should have been there, complaining about the weather, talking about engines, pretending not to notice how difficult life had become for Mason. The waitress approached. Diane, late 60s, kind eyes, one of the few people who still treated him normally. Coffee? Mason nodded. Please. She poured the cup, then lowered her voice. People are talking. I figured. Most of them don't know what they're talking about. Mason managed a faint smile. That's usually how it works. Diane glanced around. They say Raymond left you the old airfield. He did. Her eyebrows lifted. Well, what? She hesitated. Raymond never let anyone near that place. The statement caught Mason's attention. What do you mean? He'd get angry if anyone even mentioned it. That surprised him. Raymond rarely got angry about anything. Diane leaned closer. About 15 years ago, some investors wanted to buy it. And? He threw them off the property himself. Mason stared. The image was hard to imagine. 80-year-old Raymond chasing businessmen out of the mountains. Yet somehow it sounded true. Before Mason could ask more questions, the diner door opened. The room instantly became quieter. Travis Bishop walked inside. 2 men followed him. Both wore expensive jackets. Neither looked like locals. Travis immediately spotted Mason. A slow smile crossed his face, the kind that never reached the eyes. He approached the booth. Atlas stood, not aggressively, protectively, positioning himself between Mason and the newcomers. Travis looked down at the dog. Still carrying your bodyguard around? Mason ignored the comment. What do you want? Travis slid into the booth opposite him without invitation. The 2 strangers remained standing. We need to talk about the hangar. Mason's jaw tightened. I'm not selling. Travis laughed. You don't even know what you're refusing. One of the strangers stepped forward. A clean-cut man with polished boots and a practiced smile. Name's Carl Jensen. He extended a hand. Mason didn't take it. The man withdrew it awkwardly. My company develops commercial properties throughout western Montana. Mason already knew where this was going. Carl continued. The airfield sits on valuable land. It's not for sale. You haven't heard the offer. I don't need to. Travis leaned forward. His patience was already fading. Listen carefully. The entire diner had gone silent. Everyone was listening now. Everyone. My uncle wasn't thinking clearly near the end. Mason stared back. He seemed pretty clear to me. A flash of anger crossed Travis's face. You think he wanted some homeless drifter running around on family property? The words hung in the air. A few people looked uncomfortable. Others watched eagerly. Mason had heard worse. Far worse. Yet something about hearing it in Raymond's booth felt wrong. Atlas released a low growl. Quiet, controlled, enough to make the strangers step back. Travis noticed. You should keep that dog under control. Mason finally stood. The movement alone changed the atmosphere. Years of military training still showed when he moved. Years of carrying responsibility. Years of surviving. The booth suddenly felt smaller. So should you. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Travis stood as well. Neither man looked away. The tension stretched, until Diane stepped between them. "Take it outside." Her voice carried surprising authority. The standoff broke. Travis adjusted his jacket, but before leaving, he leaned closer. "You'll figure it out eventually." "Figure out what?" "The hangar is nothing but rust and problems." His smile returned. "And when you do, I'll still be here." Then he walked out. The strangers followed. The diner slowly returned to life. Conversations resumed. But Mason noticed something. Several people had changed their expressions. The laughter was gone. Now there was curiosity, maybe even concern. Because if developers suddenly wanted the property, perhaps it wasn't worthless after all. Later that night, Mason parked near the edge of town, a place overlooking the valley. The stars shone brilliantly above the mountains. Atlas sat beside him near a small camp stove. Neither seemed interested in sleep. Mason unfolded the map again, studied the airfield, the roads, the surrounding land. Questions piled higher every hour. Then headlights appeared, approaching slowly. A pickup truck, older, dust-covered. The vehicle stopped nearby. A woman stepped out. Tall, confident, wrapped in a ranch jacket. Mason recognized her immediately. Sarah Whitaker. Her ranch bordered thousands of acres west of town, widowed several years earlier, respected by nearly everyone. Atlas surprised him. The German shepherd walked directly toward her. No hesitation, no suspicion, no warning growl. Sarah smiled. "Well," she knelt. Atlas allowed her to scratch behind his ears, an honor few strangers received. "Looks like I passed the inspection." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Most people don't." "I know." She glanced toward the mountains. "You inherited Raymond's place." "Apparently." Sarah nodded. Then her expression became serious. "Be careful." Those words immediately caught Mason's attention. "Why?" She looked toward the darkness beyond town, toward the mountains, toward the hidden hangar. Because people only fight that hard over something when they think it's valuable. The wind swept across the valley. Atlas lifted his head, listening, watching, as if he agreed. And for the first time, Mason realized something unsettling. The mystery wasn't getting smaller. It was getting bigger, much bigger. And somewhere beneath that mountain hangar, Atlas was still trying to show him why. The thought stayed with Mason Hale through the entire night. The Montana sky stretched overhead, bright with stars, while cold mountain wind swept across the valley below. Most people would have found the silence peaceful. For Mason, silence could be dangerous. Silence left room for memories. He sat on the tailgate of his truck, staring toward the dark outline of the mountains. Atlas lay nearby, at least for a while. Then the German shepherd stood, without a sound, without hesitation, and walked toward the passenger door. Mason frowned. "You ready to leave already?" Atlas stared toward the mountains, toward the hangar, then looked back at Mason. Waiting. The dog wasn't tired. He wasn't resting. He wanted to go back. Now. The behavior continued through breakfast. It continued through sunrise. By mid-morning, Mason finally gave up, pretending it wasn't happening. The moment he started the truck, Atlas became alert. The moment they turned toward the mountain road, the dog visibly relaxed, as if they were finally heading where they belonged. The climb into the Bitterroots felt different this time. The mystery no longer seemed distant. It felt personal. Every mile carried them closer to whatever Raymond Bishop had hidden. closer to whatever Atlas had already discovered. The forest greeted them with cold air and long shadows. Fresh snow remained in the shaded areas. Pine trees towered over the road. The farther they drove, the more isolated the world became. Eventually, the hangar appeared. Silent, massive, waiting. Atlas jumped from the truck before Mason had fully parked. The shepherd ran straight toward the rear section of the building. Not the aircraft, not the doors, not the workbenches. The concrete. Always the concrete. Mason followed. The dog immediately began scratching. Claw after claw scraped against the same section of floor. Dust scattered. The sound echoed through the enormous structure. Atlas didn't stop. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 20. The dog remained completely focused. Mason knelt beside him. The color difference was easier to see today. A rectangular section. Subtle. Old. Different from the surrounding floor. His fingers traced a faint seam. Something had definitely been altered here. Years ago, maybe decades. "All right, buddy," Mason said quietly. "I see it." Atlas barked once. The same sharp bark he'd used during military searches. A signal. A confirmation. Mason stood and began searching the hangar more carefully. He moved shelves, inspected walls, checked maintenance records. Every clue seemed to point toward Raymond's military years. Several old supply crates carried markings from government contracts dating back 40 years. A map pinned behind one workbench showed locations throughout Montana. Remote valleys, mountain communities, backcountry regions unreachable during winter. The map itself wasn't strange. What was strange were the handwritten notes, landing zones, emergency access points, medical supply routes. None of it matched a combat operation. It looked more like a rescue network. Hours passed. Atlas never left the concrete. Not once. By noon, Mason stepped outside for air. The cold wind felt good against his face. His mind was racing. A movement near the fence line caught his attention. A pickup truck approached. Sarah Whitaker. The ranch owner parked beside the hangar and stepped out carrying a thermos. Atlas surprised him again. The dog immediately relaxed. His tail wagged once, a rare sign of approval. Sarah noticed. "Guess I passed the second inspection." Mason smiled slightly. "Looks that way." She handed him a cup of coffee. They stood together looking at the hangar. The mountains surrounded them on every side. Silent giants watching from a distance. "You've been here all day?" Sarah asked. "Most of it." "Find anything?" Mason hesitated, then nodded toward the building. Atlas did. Sarah looked curious. Inside, Atlas remained beside the concrete, watching, waiting. She studied the scene. "He hasn't moved?" "Not really." The rancher frowned. "That's not normal." "No, it isn't." Sarah crouched beside Atlas. The shepherd immediately tapped the concrete with one paw, then looked at her, then at Mason. The message couldn't have been clearer. Dig here. Even Sarah seemed unsettled. Animals noticed things humans missed. Everyone living in the mountains understood that. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Mason looked at the floor. "I think I'm going to start digging." Before Sarah could answer, the sound of an engine echoed outside. Both turned. Another truck. This one wasn't familiar. Then a second vehicle appeared, and a third. The convoy rolled toward the hangar. Black SUVs, expensive, out of place. Mason immediately felt his guard rise. Atlas reacted first. The German shepherd moved in front of Mason, protective, focused. The vehicles stopped. Doors opened. 3 men stepped out. None looked local. Business shoes, pressed jackets, professional smiles. The lead man approached. "Mr. Hale?" Mason didn't answer immediately. "Who's asking?" The man flashed a polished smile. "My name is Richard Cole. I represent several interested parties regarding this property." Interested parties. The phrase sounded rehearsed. Corporate. Calculated. "We'd like to discuss purchasing the airfield." Sarah folded her arms. "You're a long way from the city." Richard ignored her. His attention remained on Mason. "The offer is substantial. It's not for sale." The answer came instantly. Richard's smile weakened. "You haven't heard the number." "Doesn't matter." For a brief moment, annoyance flashed across the man's face. Then it vanished. Professional again. "If you change your mind, here's my card." He handed it over. Mason never reached for it. Atlas stepped forward. Not aggressive, but unmistakably protective. The businessman slowly withdrew the card. The message was understood. The convoy eventually departed. But not before the men spent several moments studying the hangar, studying the aircraft, studying the property, like investors examining a prize. When they finally disappeared down the mountain road, Sarah looked troubled. "That was fast." Mason nodded. "Too fast." Raymond had barely been buried, yet somehow people already knew enough to show up with offers. As evening approached, Sarah left for her ranch. The mountains darkened. Shadows stretched across the valley, and Atlas remained at his post. The scratching had started again, hour after hour, relentless, obsessive, determined. By nightfall, his paws were raw. Mason finally forced him to stop. The dog resisted, for the first time in years. A direct command, ignored. Atlas returned to the concrete. Again and again. Long after darkness filled the hangar, long after the wind began rattling the walls. Mason eventually fell asleep in an old office near the workbench. Exhaustion finally won. The nightmare came almost immediately. Gunfire, smoke, screaming, the mission, the loss, the guilt. Mason woke with a violent gasp. His heart pounded, sweat covered his face. For a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't remember where he was. Then he noticed something. Atlas wasn't beside him. The dog was gone. Mason grabbed a flashlight and rushed into the darkness. The beam swept across the hangar, the aircraft, the workbenches, the fuel drums. Then finally, the concrete. Atlas stood exactly where he'd been all day, guarding it, waiting. His paws were bleeding. His body trembled from exhaustion. Yet he refused to leave. The flashlight revealed something new. A small section of concrete had chipped away. Beneath it, barely visible through dust and debris, Mason saw metal. Not rebar, not pipes, a steel surface, deliberately hidden. His pulse quickened. Atlas looked at him, then collapsed. The German shepherd finally dropped to the floor, exhausted, spent, still facing the hidden spot, still protecting it. And for the first time, Mason knew with absolute certainty, Atlas hadn't been chasing a feeling. He'd found something, something buried, something Raymond Bishop never wanted the world to see. And now the secret was beginning to emerge. The beam of Mason Hale's flashlight trembled slightly as it illuminated the exposed strip of steel beneath the broken concrete. Outside, wind rattled the hangar walls. Inside, silence pressed against him from every direction. Atlas lay nearby, exhausted. His paws were scraped raw. His breathing was heavy. Yet even now, the German shepherd refused to look away from the hidden section of floor. Mason knelt beside him. You found it, didn't you? Atlas lifted his head. His tired tail tapped the concrete once. That was all the answer Mason needed. The first light of dawn filtered through the upper windows before Mason moved again. He cleaned and bandaged Atlas's paws using supplies sauce from his truck. The dog tolerated the treatment without complaint. Years of military service had taught both of them how to endure pain. Still, Mason hated seeing him injured. You should be resting. Atlas responded by looking directly at the hidden steel. The message remained the same. Keep going. Mason sighed. You really won't let this go. The shepherd's ears twitched. Not a chance. An hour later, Mason began pulling equipment from around the hangar. Crowbars, old jacks, concrete tools. The place seemed to contain everything Raymond could have possibly needed, as though the old veteran had prepared for every scenario imaginable, including this one. Dust filled the air as Mason chipped away at the damaged section. The work was slow. The concrete was thicker than expected, stronger, deliberately reinforced. That fact alone told him something important. Whoever built this wanted it hidden, permanently. By noon, sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cold mountain air. Chunks of broken concrete surrounded the work area. More steel became visible. A rectangular plate, several feet across, industrial grade, military grade. Not improvised, not accidental. Purpose-built. Mason sat back and stared. His pulse quickened. The feeling reminded him of missions overseas, those moments before opening a door, before discovering what waited on the other side. Atlas limped closer. The dog placed one paw directly on the steel plate, then looked at Mason. The same signal, the same certainty. Mason examined the edges carefully. Eventually, he found what he was looking for. A recessed handle, hidden beneath decades of dust. His heart began pounding. This wasn't a repair hatch. This wasn't storage. This was an entrance. He wrapped both hands around the handle, pulled. Nothing. The hatch didn't move. He tried again. Still nothing. Locked. Of course it was locked. Mason sat back. Frustration briefly flared. Then his eyes drifted toward the workbench, toward the collection of keys Raymond had left behind. The brass keys. The ones that had opened the hangar. The realization struck immediately. He hurried across the building. The keys remained where he'd left them. One by one, he examined each. Most were large, industrial, but one stood out. Smaller, different. Its shape matched no ordinary lock. Mason returned to the hatch. A keyhole waited beneath a layer of grime. His stomach tightened. The small key slid inside perfectly. For a moment, he simply stared. Raymond had planned every step, every discovery, every answer. Slowly, Mason turned the key. A metallic click echoed beneath the floor. Then another, then another. Heavy locking mechanisms disengaged somewhere below. Atlas immediately stood. Every trace of exhaustion vanished. His focus sharpened. The hatch released. Mason pulled harder. This time it moved. Cold air rushed upward from the darkness below. Not stale air. Fresh air. Ventilated. Maintained. Impossible. The opening revealed a steel staircase descending into blackness. Mason's flashlight disappeared into the depths without reaching the bottom. Atlas moved first. Mason stopped him. No, the dog looked annoyed. You stay beside me. Atlas reluctantly obeyed. Together they descended. Each footstep echoed through the hidden chamber. The air grew cooler. The walls changed from concrete to reinforced steel. The deeper they went, the more impossible the place became. At the bottom of the stairs, Mason stopped. His flashlight swept across the room, and for a moment he forgot how to breathe. The bunker stretched far beneath the hangar, far larger than anything he imagined. Rows of equipment lined the walls: communications consoles, storage lockers, generators, maps, shelving units packed with carefully labeled supplies. Nothing looked abandoned. Nothing looked forgotten. Everything looked preserved. Waiting. Atlas moved cautiously through the chamber. His nose worked constantly, searching, confirming. The dog looked less surprised than Mason, as though some instinct had led him here all along. Mason approached a wall covered with maps. Most depicted Montana. Others showed neighboring states. Red markings identified remote communities, mountain settlements, isolated valleys, emergency routes, landing zones, supply caches. Every map focused on one thing: rescue. Not combat. Not surveillance. Rescue. Nearby stood shelves containing medical kits, radios, emergency blankets, water purification equipment, and enough supplies to support hundreds of people. The realization struck him slowly. Raymond hadn't been preparing for war. He'd been preparing for disaster, for emergencies, for people in need. A different kind of mission, one no less important. Atlas suddenly barked, a single sharp sound. Mason turned. The dog stood beside a metal cabinet near the back wall. Its surface was spotless compared to everything around it, as if Raymond had opened it often. Mason approached. The cabinet door wasn't locked. Inside sat dozens of neatly organized binders, maintenance logs, operational plans, communications records, and one object resting alone on the center shelf: a steel case, unlike anything else in the room. It wasn't large, roughly the size of a briefcase. Its dark surface showed signs of age, yet it remained perfectly maintained. Mason's flashlight beam moved across the lid, then stopped. His pulse froze. Painted across the metal in white block letters were 4 words: for Mason Hale. He stared, certain he was mistaken. Then he looked again. The words remained: for Mason Hale. Not for the government, not for Raymond's family, not for whoever inherited the property. For him, specifically. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier, every question multiplied. How long had Raymond known? Why him? Why spend decades preparing something intended for a homeless veteran nobody else believed in? Atlas sat beside the case, quiet, watchful, patient, as if he already understood what Mason was only beginning to realize. This discovery wasn't accidental. Raymond had expected him to come here, expected Atlas to find the bunker, expected this exact moment. Mason slowly reached for the steel case. His fingers brushed the cold metal. The mystery that had begun with a funeral and a set of brass keys had just become something far bigger. Because whatever answers waited inside this case, Raymond Bishop had spent 40 years making sure they reached one man, and one man alone: Mason Hale. The words painted across the steel case seemed impossible. For several seconds, Mason simply stared. The flashlight trembled slightly in his hand. Not from fear, from disbelief. Atlas sat quietly beside the cabinet. The old German shepherd's breathing had slowed. His mission, at least for the moment, appeared complete. He had found what Raymond wanted found. Now it was Mason's turn. Slowly, he lifted the case from the shelf. It was heavier than it looked. The steel felt cold against his hands. Years of dust surrounded it, yet the surface itself remained clean, maintained, protected. Just like everything else Raymond had hidden beneath the hangar. Mason carried the case to a nearby work table. The bunker remained silent except for the low hum of ventilation equipment still functioning somewhere deep within the walls. That alone felt surreal. 40 years, maybe longer. Yet the place still breathed. Atlas jumped onto a nearby platform and watched. Waiting. Mason carefully examined the latches. Unlike the hatch upstairs, there was no lock. Only two simple clasps, as though Raymond wanted him to open it. When he was ready, Mason released the first latch, then the second. The sound echoed through the bunker. His pulse quickened. The lid slowly opened. Inside lay only 3 items: a thick envelope, a cassette recorder, and a worn leather journal. Nothing else. No money. No government secrets. No treasure. Just 3 objects. Yet somehow they felt more important than anything else in the room. The envelope sat on top. Written across it in careful handwriting were words Mason recognized immediately. Raymond's handwriting. To Mason. If you're reading this, Atlas did his job. A sudden lump formed in Mason's throat. He glanced toward the dog. Atlas tilted his head, completely unaware of the weight those words carried, or perhaps aware in ways humans couldn't understand. Mason opened the envelope. A folded letter rested inside. Several pages, handwritten, personal. The ink had faded slightly with age, but every word remained clear. Mason began reading. My friend, if you've reached this room, then I'm no longer around to explain things myself. That wasn't my first choice. But life doesn't always give us the timing we'd like. First, let me tell you something important. None of this happened by accident. Not the hangar, not the aircraft, not the bunker, and certainly not you. Mason paused. The words felt strangely direct, as though Raymond were sitting across from him in the diner once more, coffee in hand, speaking quietly, patiently. Mason continued. Years ago, after returning from the war, I made a promise that if I ever had the ability to help people, I would never stop. Not because it was easy, because it was necessary. The world has no shortage of people willing to profit from tragedy. It has a shortage of people willing to answer it. Mason swallowed hard. The letter continued. The aircraft upstairs was never built to fight. Most people will assume otherwise. They're wrong. It was designed to reach places nobody else could reach. Mountain communities, flood zones, wildfire regions, areas abandoned when roads disappeared and help arrived too late. For decades, I protected it. Not because it belonged to me, because someday someone would need it. The words seemed to change the entire meaning of the hangar, the aircraft, the bunker, everything. This wasn't a military weapon. It was a rescue tool, a lifeline, a forgotten mission. Mason kept reading. For years, I searched for someone who could continue the work. Not someone perfect, not someone wealthy, not someone famous, someone trustworthy, someone who understood responsibility, someone who knew what sacrifice looked like. At that point, Mason lowered the page. His chest tightened. He already knew where this was going, and he wasn't sure he wanted to hear it. Atlas slowly approached. The dog rested his head against Mason's knee, grounding him, keeping him present, just as he always had. Mason took a deep breath and continued. The first time I noticed you was 6 years ago. You probably don't remember. The snowstorm outside Hamilton. You and Atlas were living out of that old truck even then. Most people drove past. Most people looked away. You didn't. You stopped for strangers. You spent hours helping people get home. You nearly froze doing it. Nobody thanked you. Nobody knew. You did it anyway. Mason closed his eyes. The memory returned. A terrible winter storm. Dozens of stranded vehicles. Long hours in freezing temperatures. He hadn't thought about that day in years. Apparently Raymond had. The letter continued. But that wasn't when I made my decision. The page trembled slightly in Mason's hands. The decision came later. When I saw you walk into a river during spring runoff, everyone thought you were crazy. Maybe they were right, but I watched you risk your life to save Atlas after he slipped through the ice. You could have left him. Nobody would have blamed you. Instead, you nearly drowned pulling him out. That told me everything I needed to know. Mason stopped reading. Emotion tightened his throat. Across the years, that memory remained vivid. Atlas had fallen through unstable ice during a mountain rescue. Without hesitation, Mason had gone after him. Neither had escaped uninjured. Yet he never regretted it. Not once. Atlas looked up at him now. Older. Slower. Grayer around the muzzle. Still loyal. Still there. The letter rested heavily in Mason's hands. I wasn't looking for a pilot. I wasn't looking for a mechanic. I wasn't looking for another soldier. I was looking for a guardian. Someone who understood that lives matter even when nobody is watching. Someone who would never leave another soul behind. You are that person, whether you believe it or not. Mason stared at the final sentence for a long time. The bunker felt strangely quiet. Not empty. Peaceful. As if Raymond had finally said what he'd been carrying for years. Atlas settled beside him. The old dog let out a slow sigh. For the first time in a very long while, Mason felt something shift inside him. Not healing. Not yet. The wounds were too deep for that. But something moved. A small crack in the walls he'd built around himself. For years, he had seen himself exactly as the town saw him. A homeless veteran. A broken man. A survivor who never figured out how to come home. Yet Raymond had seen something different. Something worth trusting. Something worth preparing 40 years for. Mason wiped a hand across his face, then looked back at the remaining pages. There was more. Much more. Diagrams, maps, operational notes, descriptions of supply networks, volunteer contacts, emergency response plans. Entire systems Raymond had quietly maintained for decades. A mission hidden in plain sight. Waiting. Waiting for someone to continue it. Outside the bunker, wind howled through the mountains. The storm had returned. Snowflakes drifted against the hangar windows far above. The world remained unaware of what existed beneath that lonely structure. Unaware of the aircraft, the bunker, the mission. Unaware that one old veteran had spent 40 years preserving hope for strangers he would never meet. Mason folded the letter carefully, then placed it back inside the envelope. His eyes moved toward the cassette recorder. A small label had been attached. For when you're ready. Raymond's handwriting again. Mason stared at it. A new set of answers waited there. Perhaps even more questions. But not today. Today he simply sat beside Atlas. The two of them alone in the hidden bunker. One grieving an old friend. The other quietly guarding the future that friend had left behind. And for the first time since Raymond's funeral, Mason no longer wondered why he had inherited the hangar. The real question now was far more difficult. What was he supposed to do with it? The answer did not come that day, or the next. For nearly a week, Mason Hale remained at the hangar, moving between the bunker below and the silent aircraft above. The mountains settled into early winter. Snow dusted the surrounding ridges. The wind grew colder, the nights grew longer, and every day brought more questions. Atlas stayed close. His injured paws were healing slowly, though the old German shepherd still limped when he walked too far. Mason did his best to keep him resting. Atlas did his best to ignore those instructions. Some things never changed. The bunker revealed more secrets with every hour. The maps, the supply inventories, the emergency response plans. Hundreds of pages of records detailed a network Raymond Bishop had quietly maintained for decades. Many entries described natural disasters, floods, wildfires, winter storms, landslides, remote communities isolated by geography and weather. The aircraft had always been intended for one purpose: helping people no one else could reach. Mason sat at one of the bunker's work tables late one evening, reading another binder under the glow of an old desk lamp. Atlas slept nearby. The bunker felt oddly comforting now. Safe, predictable, a place built around purpose, something Mason hadn't felt in years. Then headlights appeared outside. Multiple vehicles, approaching fast. Atlas was awake instantly. The shepherd rose before the vehicles even reached the property. His ears lifted, his posture changed, alert, protective. Mason extinguished the lamp. Together they climbed the staircase to the hangar above. The vehicles entered the clearing moments later. 3 SUVs, black, expensive, official-looking. They parked in a line near the entrance. Mason immediately recognized one of them, the same convoy that had visited before. But this time they weren't alone. 2 additional trucks followed. Then another vehicle, and another. Too many, far too many. The driver's door opened. Richard Cole stepped out first. The corporate representative wore the same polished smile, but tonight it looked strained, nervous. Behind him emerged several unfamiliar men. Some wore business attire. Others carried folders and cases. Lawyers, executives, people who lived behind desks. Atlas moved beside Mason, silent, watching. The mountain wind whipped through the clearing. Nobody spoke for several moments. Finally, Richard approached. "Mr. Hale. Mr. Cole." The smile returned. "We should talk." "We already did." Richard glanced toward the hangar, toward the aircraft hidden beneath its tarp, toward the mountains beyond. His eyes lingered there. "Hungry. We're prepared to make a significantly improved offer." Mason folded his arms. "I'm not selling." One of the lawyers stepped forward. A woman with silver hair and an expensive coat. "Perhaps you should hear the details before deciding." "I've already decided." The lawyer exchanged a glance with Richard. The practiced confidence began slipping. Apparently, they weren't accustomed to hearing no. Richard cleared his throat. "Mr. Hale, the property contains assets worth a substantial amount of money." Mason remained silent. The man continued. "The aircraft alone could attract private collectors, museums, contractors. It's not for sale." The answer came faster this time, sharper, final. The businessman sighed, then tried a different tactic. "Do you even know what you're sitting on?" Mason looked directly at him. "No." The honesty surprised everyone. Richard blinked, then smiled. "As I suspected." He opened a folder. Photographs emerged. Aircraft schematics, historical records, government contracts. Years of research. "We've spent considerable resources investigating Bishop Airfield." Mason's attention sharpened. How long had they been investigating? Before Raymond died? Before the will? The realization unsettled him. The businessman noticed. "You should understand something." The mountain wind intensified. Snow drifted across the clearing. Richard lowered his voice. "Other people are becoming interested." "Who?" The man hesitated. "Too long. Government agencies, military contractors, private investors. Exactly the kinds of people Raymond spent decades avoiding. Mason suddenly understood something important. The attention wasn't new. Raymond had been protecting this place from them for years, perhaps decades, and now that Raymond was gone, the wolves smelled opportunity. Atlas released a low growl. Quiet, controlled, yet impossible to ignore. Several visitors shifted uncomfortably. Richard glanced down at the dog, then back at Mason. Think carefully. No. The businessman shook his head. You're thinking emotionally. Mason almost laughed. If only he knew. The problem wasn't emotion. The problem was trust. Years in the military had taught Mason to recognize people pursuing a mission and people pursuing profit. These men weren't here to save lives. They were here to acquire something valuable. Nothing more. Richard finally closed the folder. The smile disappeared completely. Then this conversation isn't over. No. Mason looked toward the road. It is. The standoff lasted several seconds. Then the visitors returned to their vehicles. One by one, engines started. Doors closed. Headlights swept across the clearing. The convoy departed. But something about the encounter felt wrong. Not defeated. Delayed. Like a storm moving just beyond the horizon. The next morning proved that feeling correct. Mason drove into town for supplies. Atlas accompanied him. The German shepherd never left his side. The atmosphere changed immediately. People stared, whispered, watched. Something had happened. Something recent. At the diner, Diane handed him a cup of coffee before he even sat down. Her expression looked troubled. "What now?" Mason asked. "You should see this." She handed him a newspaper. The local headline covered nearly half the front page. Mystery airfield sparks legal questions. The article mentioned Raymond, the hangar, the inheritance, and most concerning, unnamed parties questioning ownership rights. Mason's jaw tightened. Travis. It had to be Travis. As if summoned by the thought, the diner door opened. Raymond's nephew walked inside. This time he wasn't smiling. He looked angry, very angry. Travis approached directly. No hesitation, no pretending. "You should have sold." Mason folded the paper. "You should have respected your uncle's wishes." The words hit harder than expected. Travis's face darkened. He wasn't in his right mind. "You keep saying that." "Because it's true." Atlas stood. Not threatening. Not aggressive. Simply present. A reminder. A barrier. Travis noticed. The room fell silent again. Everyone watching. Everyone listening. The tension stretched. Then Travis reached into his coat. For a brief instant, Mason's instincts flared. Combat reflexes. Years of training. Then Travis produced a document. Not a weapon. A lawsuit. He dropped it onto the table. "We're contesting the will." The words landed like a hammer. Silence followed. Then Travis leaned closer. "You think this is about land?" Mason stared. The man smiled bitterly. "It isn't." Something flickered behind his eyes. Something almost fearful. Then it vanished. And that bothered Mason more than the lawsuit. Because for the first time, Travis looked less like a greedy relative, and more like someone desperate to keep a secret buried. A secret Raymond never wanted exposed. The nephew turned and walked away. The diner remained silent. Atlas slowly sat back down, but Mason barely noticed. His thoughts were racing. The aircraft, the bunker, the rescue mission, the corporate offers, the lawsuit, the attention. Every day the pressure increased. Every day more people arrived. And for the first time since discovering the bunker, doubt began creeping into Mason's mind. Not about Raymond, about himself. Because what if Richard was right? What if this responsibility was bigger than he could carry? What if Raymond had chosen wrong? The questions followed him all the way back into the mountains. And that night, as snow began falling heavily outside the hangar, Mason sat alone in the bunker, staring at the cassette recorder Raymond had left behind. Atlas rested beside him. The dog sensed the change immediately. The anxiety, the uncertainty, the fear. The recorder remained untouched, waiting. Just like the mission. Waiting. And for the first time since opening the letter, Mason seriously considered walking away from everything. The thought lingered longer than he wanted to admit. Outside, snow fell steadily across the Bitterroot Mountains. The hangar groaned softly beneath the weight of winter. Inside the bunker, the small lamp cast long shadows across Raymond Bishop's maps and journals. Mason sat alone at the work table. Atlas slept nearby. The old German shepherd's chest rose and fell in a slow rhythm. Peaceful, trusting, completely unaware of the battle taking place inside Mason's mind. The pressure was becoming impossible to ignore. The lawsuit, the investors, the mysterious interests surrounding the aircraft, the responsibility Raymond had left behind. Every direction seemed to lead toward conflict, and conflict was something Mason had spent years trying to escape. Not because he feared it, because he was tired. Tired in a way most people never understood. Combat had taken things from him. Friends, sleep, certainty, pieces of himself. For years he'd survived by keeping life small, simple, manageable. Now Raymond's inheritance threatened to change everything. Atlas stirred. His eyes opened. The dog immediately looked toward Mason, studied him, watching. The same way he'd watched him after difficult missions overseas, as if he sensed every crack forming beneath the surface. Mason forced a smile. "I'm fine." Atlas clearly disagreed. The next morning brought clear skies. Fresh snow sparkled beneath brilliant sunlight. The mountains looked almost untouched. Beautiful, silent, dangerous. Mason needed space. Time to think. So he loaded supplies into the truck. Atlas climbed into the passenger seat. An hour later, they followed an old Forest Service road deeper into the wilderness. The route appeared on several of Raymond's maps, one of many marked emergency access points. Mason wanted to understand the terrain, understand the mission Raymond had spent decades preparing for. The road climbed steadily through dense pine forests. Snow-covered branches arched overhead. Frozen streams cut through narrow ravines. The deeper they traveled, the more isolated everything became. Atlas seemed happier away from the bunker, away from the tension. His ears remained alert. His nose worked constantly, tracking scents carried by the mountain wind. For several hours they explored, stopping occasionally to examine old trail markers and abandoned service routes. Many connected directly to locations identified in Raymond's records. The old veteran had clearly known these mountains better than anyone. Then the weather changed. Without warning. Mountain weather often did. Clouds rolled over distant peaks. Dark. Heavy. Fast. The sunlight vanished. A sharp wind swept through the trees. Atlas noticed first. His posture stiffened. He looked toward the western ridges, watching, listening. The dog had saved Mason's life more than once by noticing danger early. Mason trusted those instincts. "We should head back." The shepherd immediately agreed. Unfortunately, the mountain had other plans. The storm arrived faster than expected. Snow blasted across the road. Visibility dropped. The forest disappeared behind a wall of white. The truck crawled forward carefully. Every turn became difficult, every mile slower. Then came the sound. A sharp crack, loud, violent. Mason's head snapped upward. Years of training reacted instantly. Not gunfire. Wood. A tree. Atlas! The warning came too late. The massive pine had already begun falling, its roots ripped free from the frozen ground. The trunk crashed downward toward the road, toward the truck, toward Mason. There wasn't enough time. No room to maneuver. No escape route. Everything happened in seconds. Atlas exploded into motion. The German Shepherd launched himself across the cab. The force knocked Mason sideways just as the windshield shattered. The tree slammed into the truck. Glass erupted. Metal screamed. The world spun. Then silence. For several seconds, Mason couldn't hear anything except ringing. Snow drifted through the broken windshield. The cab had partially collapsed. The steering wheel was bent. The front end crushed. Mason's head throbbed. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye. Slowly he looked around. Atlas? No answer. Panic hit instantly. Real panic. The kind that ignored training, ignored experience, ignored logic. Atlas! Then he saw him. The German Shepherd lay partially pinned beneath twisted metal and shattered branches, motionless, a terrible stillness. Mason's stomach dropped. No. Not Atlas. Not him. He tore at the debris, ignoring pain, ignoring the cold, ignoring everything. The branches fought back. The metal wouldn't move. Snow continued falling. The storm intensified. Come on, buddy. His voice cracked. Come on. Finally, something shifted. Enough. Mason forced the debris aside. Atlas moved. Barely. But he moved. Relief nearly brought Mason to his knees. The dog was alive. Injured. But alive. Atlas opened one eye, then struggled to stand. A low whine escaped him. His rear leg buckled immediately. Mason felt another wave of fear. The injury looked serious, possibly broken. Maybe worse. The mountain road had become completely impassable. No cell service, no nearby help, just snow, wind, and miles of wilderness. Mason took a slow breath. Focus. One problem at a time. The first priority wasn't the truck. It wasn't the mission. It wasn't the hangar. It was Atlas. Nothing else mattered. He removed his jacket and wrapped it around the dog. Atlas attempted to stand again. Failed. The look in the shepherd's eyes hit harder than the injury itself. Confusion, frustration, a dog who desperately wanted to keep protecting his partner. Mason knelt beside him. You already saved me. The words caught in his throat. You don't have to do anything else. Atlas leaned against him, trusting him completely. The same trust he'd shown on countless missions. The same trust he'd shown every day since. Mason carefully lifted the dog into his arms. Atlas wasn't light. Even older and leaner, the shepherd weighed enough to make the task difficult, especially through deep snow, especially with the storm growing stronger. But Mason never considered another option. Not for a second. Step by step, he carried Atlas through the blizzard. The mountains disappeared behind curtains of white. The wind howled. Snow stung exposed skin. Hours seemed to pass, though it was probably less. Time became meaningless. The only thing that mattered was moving. One foot, then another. Atlas remained quiet, occasionally lifting his head, checking on Mason. Even now, still protecting him. The irony wasn't lost. Eventually, a shape emerged through the storm. A ranger shelter. Old, weathered, abandoned for most of the year. But standing. Standing was enough. Mason pushed inside. The small structure blocked the wind. The silence felt overwhelming after the storm. He gently lowered Atlas onto an old cot. The shepherd's breathing remained steady. Thank God. Mason examined the injury. Painful. Serious. But survivable. Relief washed through him. Slowly. Powerfully. Atlas watched him the entire time, as though making sure Mason was all right. As though nothing else mattered. Hours later, while the storm raged outside, Mason sat beside the cot. His hand rested on the dog's neck. The shelter remained quiet. The mission, the aircraft, the lawsuits, the pressure, none of it seemed important anymore. Not compared to this. Not compared to the possibility of losing the one companion who had never abandoned him. Raymond's words returned unexpectedly. I was looking for a guardian. Mason stared at Atlas. The old dog slept peacefully now. For the first time since discovering the bunker, the answer became clear. The aircraft wasn't the heart of Raymond's mission. People were. Lives were. Loyalty was. Sacrifice was. And in that frozen mountain shelter, watching snow drift past the windows, Mason realized something that frightened him more than any lawsuit ever could. The mission meant nothing if he lost Atlas. Nothing at all. And for the first time since the tree fell, a terrifying possibility entered his mind. What if Atlas wasn't going to recover? The question followed Mason Hale through the longest week of his life. The storm eventually passed. The roads reopened, and with help from a county ranger and Sarah Whitaker, Mason managed to bring Atlas back to the hangar. A veterinarian from town examined the German shepherd thoroughly. The diagnosis could have been worse. No broken spine, no internal injuries, but severe damage to muscles and ligaments in his rear leg. Recovery would take time. Months, possibly. And at Atlas's age, there were no guarantees. The words landed harder than any punch. No guarantees. Mason had heard those words before. Hospitals, battlefields, funeral services. They never got easier. The hangar felt different now. Quieter. The mystery had been replaced by waiting. Every morning Mason checked Atlas first. Every morning the old shepherd tried to stand before he should. And every morning Mason had to convince him to rest. Atlas hated resting. He always had. Outside, winter deepened across the Bitterroot Mountains. Snow blanketed the valley. Icicles hung from the edges of the hangar roof. The aircraft remained hidden beneath its tarp. The bunker remained full of unanswered questions. But for nearly 2 weeks, Mason barely touched any of it. Nothing seemed more important than Atlas. One evening, after another long day of recovery exercises, the dog finally drifted into a deep sleep. Mason sat alone in the bunker. The small lamp illuminated Raymond Bishop's maps and journals. The cassette recorder remained where he had left it. Waiting. Just as Raymond intended. Mason stared at it for a long time, then finally reached out. The plastic felt old beneath his fingers. A label remained attached. For when you're ready. Maybe he was. Maybe he wasn't. Either way, he pressed play. Static crackled through the speaker. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then Raymond's voice emerged. Older, slower, but unmistakable. Well, if you're hearing this, Mason, then Atlas probably found the bunker. A faint chuckle followed. Mason immediately smiled despite himself. Only Raymond would begin a life-changing recording by talking about a dog. The recording continued. I always trusted that dog. The chuckle returned. More than most people. Mason glanced toward the staircase, toward the hangar above where Atlas slept. then looked back at the recorder. Raymond's voice softened. I suspect you're carrying more weight than you realize right now. The words landed immediately, because they were true. The recording continued. You're probably wondering why I chose you. Mason leaned forward. For weeks he had asked himself the same question. Now, finally, the answer was coming. A long pause filled the speaker. Then Raymond spoke again. I watched a lot of people over the years. The old man's voice sounded thoughtful, reflective. I watched politicians. I watched military officers. I watched investors. I watched wealthy men who could have funded this mission 10 times over. Another pause. They all wanted something. His tone hardened slightly. Recognition, control, profit. The mission was always second. Mason remained silent, listening. Outside, wind rattled the hangar walls. The recording continued. Then I watched you. A lump formed in Mason's throat. You didn't know I was paying attention. I preferred it that way. The old man laughed softly. I learned more from watching than asking. The next words changed everything. I saw a broken man trying to survive. Mason lowered his eyes. The description felt painfully accurate. But Raymond wasn't finished. I also saw something most people missed. Silence. Then, I saw a man who never stopped protecting others. Mason felt his chest tighten. Memories surfaced. The winter storm, the stranded drivers, the flooded river, the odd repair jobs he performed for elderly neighbors who couldn't afford help. Things he'd never thought twice about. Things nobody noticed. Except Raymond. The recording continued. I saw a man who protected strangers. I saw a man who protected veterans. I saw a man who protected a dog. A long pause followed. Then came the moment that changed everything. The day Atlas fell through the ice. Mason froze. Was the day I made my decision. His eyes closed. He remembered every second. The freezing water, the current, the fear, the desperate struggle to reach Atlas before the river carried him away. Raymond's voice grew quiet. You never hesitated. You never calculated the risk. You never considered leaving him. Another pause. That told me everything. Mason felt emotion rising unexpectedly. The old veteran continued. If a man is willing to risk his life for one loyal dog, the sentence hung in the air. Then he'll risk his life for people he's never met. Silence followed. Deep silence. The kind that forces truth into places you've spent years avoiding. Mason stared at the recorder, unable to speak, unable to move. For years he had measured himself by everything he lost. The missions, the nightmares, the failures, the friends who never came home. But Raymond had measured him differently. Not by what happened to him, by what he did afterward. The realization hit like sunlight breaking through clouds. Raymond's voice returned. The aircraft matters. The bunker matters. The mission matters. Then came the most important words. But none of it matters if the wrong person is carrying it. Mason felt something shift inside him. Something long frozen. Something wounded. Healing didn't happen all at once. It rarely did. But for the first time since returning from war, the future no longer looked empty. The recording neared its end. If you're listening to this, Mason, then I trust you. I trusted you before you trusted yourself. The old man's voice softened. And if Atlas is sitting nearby, give him an extra treat. Mason laughed. A genuine laugh. The first in longer than he could remember. The recording clicked off. Silence returned. But it felt different now. lighter, warmer. Above him, footsteps echoed faintly across the hangar floor. Atlas. The dog was awake. Mason climbed the stairs. The shepherd stood waiting near the workbench, his injured legs still weak, his movement still slow. Yet his tail wagged once when he saw Mason. Just once. The old military dog didn't waste energy. Mason knelt beside him, placed a hand on his neck. For several moments, neither moved. The mountains outside glowed beneath moonlight. Snow reflected silver across the valley. The world felt peaceful, for the first time in years. Mason looked toward the tarp-covered aircraft, then toward the bunker entrance, then toward Atlas. The doubts remained. The risks remained. The lawsuit remained. The pressure remained. But something fundamental had changed. He finally understood why Raymond chose him. Not because he was a Navy SEAL, not because he was capable, not because he was skilled, because he cared. Because he couldn't walk away when someone needed help. The realization settled deep inside him. Permanent, solid, certain. Atlas leaned against him. The old dog seemed content, as though he'd known the answer all along. Mason looked out across the frozen valley, then spoke aloud for the first time. "All right, Raymond." The wind whispered against the hangar walls, soft, patient, waiting. Mason nodded. "I'll do it." The words surprised even him, but they felt right. For the first time since inheriting the hangar, he wasn't running from the responsibility. He was accepting it. The broken man who arrived in the mountains searching for answers was gone. In his place stood something different, not healed, not yet, but moving forward. And somewhere beneath the snow-covered Montana sky, the mission Raymond Bishop spent 40 years protecting finally had a guardian again. Winter slowly released its grip on the Bitterroot Mountains. The deep snow receded from the valleys. Streams swelled with spring runoff. The forests began showing hints of green. And for the first time in years, Mason Hale woke each morning with purpose. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It happened one day at a time. One repair at a time. One decision at a time. The hangar became alive again. Atlas recovered steadily. The old German shepherd never regained the speed he once had, but he regained something more important: his determination. Every morning he limped across the hangar floor to inspect Mason's work. Every afternoon he supervised from the same spot beside the aircraft. Every evening he slept near the bunker entrance, still guarding the mission, still protecting his partner. The aircraft slowly emerged from beneath decades of secrecy, piece by piece, panel by panel, system by system. Mason spent months studying Raymond's journals, the bunker records, the maintenance logs, the engineering notes. The machine above was extraordinary, not because it carried weapons, because it carried possibilities. Medical supplies, communication equipment, emergency cargo. Hope. Sarah Whitaker became a regular presence at the hangar. The ranch owner delivered supplies, helped organize records, and occasionally forced Mason to eat something besides canned soup. For the first time in a long while, the isolation began fading. Others arrived too. Retired mechanics, former pilots, veterans who heard rumors and became curious. Most stayed because they believed in the mission. Word spread quietly. Not through newspapers, not through social media, through veterans. The old way. One trusted voice speaking to another. Meanwhile, the legal challenges continued. Travis Bishop fought every attempt to secure ownership. Corporate investors continued making offers. Government representatives occasionally appeared. But Mason no longer felt overwhelmed. The mission gave him direction. Direction gave him strength, and strength made fear smaller. Then summer arrived, along with disaster. The first warning came through local emergency channels. A lightning storm had ignited multiple fires in western Montana. At first, nobody seemed overly concerned. Wildfires happened every year. Most remained manageable. This one didn't. Strong winds pushed the flames into remote mountain regions. Entire valleys filled with smoke. Roads became blocked. Power lines failed. Communication towers stopped functioning. Small communities suddenly found themselves isolated. The situation worsened quickly. One afternoon, Sarah arrived at the hangar with urgency written across her face. Mason knew immediately something was wrong. "Turn on the radio." Her voice was tight, concerned. Mason complied. Emergency broadcasts filled the hangar. Evacuation orders, road closures, requests for assistance. The reports sounded increasingly desperate. Several mountain communities had become completely cut off. Landslides and fire damage prevented traditional access routes. Families remained trapped. Supplies were running low. Emergency responders were struggling to reach them. The room fell silent. Atlas looked up from his place beside the workbench. The old shepherd sensed the tension immediately. Mason looked toward the aircraft, then toward the maps, then toward the bunker. Every piece suddenly connected. This was exactly why Raymond built the network. Exactly why he preserved the aircraft. Exactly why the mission existed. The realization hit Sarah at the same moment. Her eyes widened. "Mason." He nodded. "I know." The next 24 hours became a blur. Veterans arrived, mechanics arrived, pilots arrived. The people Raymond hoped would someday answer the call. Now they were here, working, preparing, believing. Inside the hangar, the aircraft stood uncovered for the first time. Its sleek frame reflected sunlight streaming through the windows. The machine looked powerful, purposeful, alive. Atlas limped alongside Mason during every step of preparation, checking equipment, inspecting cargo, watching everything. The old dog refused to stay behind, no matter how many times Mason suggested it. On the morning of the mission, smoke stained the distant horizon. The sky glowed orange in places. The smell of wildfire drifted even into the mountain valley. A temporary operations center had formed inside the hangar. Maps covered tables. Volunteers moved with urgency. Everyone understood the stakes. Lives depended on speed. Lives depended on success. A young veteran approached Mason, nervous, excited. "Sir?" Mason smiled slightly. "Haven't been called that in years." The young man grinned, then gestured toward the aircraft. "Are we really doing this?" Mason looked toward the machine, toward the future, toward Raymond's dream. "We are." Outside, engines started. The sound echoed across the mountains. People paused, watching. Some smiled, some stared. A few looked emotional, because they understood what this moment meant. A mission buried for decades was finally waking up. Atlas stood beside the aircraft. The wind ruffled his fur. His injured leg remained stiff, yet his eyes looked brighter than Mason had seen in months. The old shepherd seemed proud. Mason knelt beside him. "You staying here?" Atlas immediately stepped toward the aircraft. The answer was obvious. Mason laughed. "You really are impossible." Sarah shook her head. "You're not winning that argument." "Apparently not." Atlas boarded. The volunteers cheered. The tension broke briefly. Even in serious moments, the old dog had a way of lifting spirits. The cargo compartments filled with emergency supplies, water filters, medical kits, communication devices, food, blankets, everything needed by isolated communities. The aircraft rolled toward the runway, a runway that had sat silent for decades. The mountains stood watch around them. The same mountains Raymond had protected. The same mountains now calling for help. Inside the cockpit, Mason completed final checks. His hands felt steady, steadier than they had in years. Not because he wasn't afraid, because he finally understood why he was here. The radio crackled. Clearance granted. The path was open. The mission was waiting. Mason looked toward Atlas. The German shepherd sat behind him, alert, focused, exactly as he had been during deployments long ago. The old partnership remained intact. The engines roared. The aircraft accelerated. Faster, faster, faster. Then the wheels left the ground. The hangar disappeared behind them. The mountains stretched beneath them. And for the first time in decades, Raymond Bishop's mission took flight. 40 minutes later, they reached the first isolated valley. The scene below was heartbreaking. Smoke covered the landscape. Roads were blocked. Emergency vehicles sat stranded miles away. Families gathered in open fields, waiting, hoping. The aircraft descended. Volunteers prepared the first supply drop. Mason focused. Training, instinct, purpose. Everything came together. The cargo released. Parachutes deployed. Supplies drifted toward the community below. People ran toward them. Children pointed skyward. Adults waved. Some simply stood in disbelief. More drops followed. Then more. Medical supplies. Emergency radios. Water purification systems. Every successful delivery felt like a promise being kept. Not just to the communities, to Raymond. Hours later, after multiple missions, they finally returned. The sun was setting. The smoke-stained sky glowed red and gold. The aircraft touched down smoothly. Cheers erupted from everyone waiting at the hangar. Volunteers, veterans, neighbors, people who understood what had happened. Lives had been saved, not through politics, not through profit, through purpose. Atlas stepped off the aircraft first. The crowd immediately surrounded him, laughing, cheering. The old German shepherd accepted the attention with surprising dignity. Mason watched quietly. A smile slowly appeared. For years he had searched for a reason to keep moving forward. Now he had one. Then a volunteer approached carrying a phone. "You're going to want to see this." Mason frowned. The young man showed him the screen. News reports, photos, videos, the aircraft, the supply drops, the rescue mission. The story was spreading fast. National attention, media interest, public curiosity. The old mission was no longer hidden. Sarah looked at him. "What are you going to do?" Mason stared at the screen for several moments, then handed it back. "Nothing." The volunteer blinked. "Nothing?" Mason looked toward the aircraft, toward Atlas, toward the volunteers unloading equipment, toward the people who believed in something bigger than themselves. "They can talk about it if they want." His voice remained calm, certain. But this was never about us, and deep down he knew that was exactly what Raymond would have said. The wildfire mission changed everything, not overnight, not all at once, but steadily, like sunrise pushing back darkness. Weeks passed, then months. The story spread far beyond western Montana. Newspapers wrote about the mysterious aircraft that had delivered emergency supplies to isolated communities. Television crews requested interviews. National organizations reached out. Former military personnel called from across the country. Retired pilots, mechanics, search and rescue specialists. People who had spent years looking for purpose after service. Many asked the same question. "How can we help?" Mason answered every one of them the same way. "Show up ready to work." And they did. The abandoned hangar slowly transformed. The rusted structure that people once mocked became something entirely different. A center of activity, a place of purpose, a place where forgotten people found a second chance. The legal battle ended sooner than anyone expected. After months of investigations, archived records confirmed Raymond Bishop's ownership arrangements and custodial agreements. The lawsuit collapsed. Travis Bishop quietly withdrew his claims. The developers disappeared. The investors moved on. For the first time since Raymond's death, the mission stood on solid ground. But the greatest changes weren't happening on paper. They were happening inside people. Veterans arrived carrying burdens similar to Mason's. Some struggled with isolation. Some battled memories. Some simply needed a reason to get out of bed each morning. The hangar gave them one. Nobody asked for perfect resumes. Nobody cared about rank. Nobody cared about politics. They cared about helping. And helping had a way of healing wounds no doctor could reach. By autumn, volunteers had restored several buildings around the property. The old maintenance offices became classrooms. Storage facilities became supply centers. Unused land became training grounds. The rescue network Raymond envisioned finally existed. Not hidden. Not waiting. Alive. Atlas remained at the center of it all. The old German shepherd had become something of a legend. Visitors arrived hoping to meet him. Children brought him treats. Veterans sat beside him during difficult days. Photographs of Atlas appeared throughout the facility. Some called him the founder. Others called him the guardian. Most simply called him a good dog. Atlas accepted the attention with the same calm dignity he carried throughout his entire life. One cool October morning, nearly a year after Raymond's funeral, Mason stood outside the hangar watching the sunrise. Golden light spilled across the Bitterroot Mountains. The peaks glowed amber. The valleys filled with mist. The scene looked almost unreal. Atlas sat beside him. His muzzle had grown even grayer, his movements slower, but his eyes remained bright. Sarah joined them carrying coffee. "You realize today's the anniversary?" Mason nodded. He hadn't forgotten. 1 year. A full year since Raymond's funeral. 1 year since a homeless veteran inherited something nobody wanted. At least that's what everyone thought. The rescue center had planned a small ceremony. Nothing extravagant. That would have embarrassed Raymond. But people wanted to honor him, wanted to acknowledge what his final gift had become. By midday, dozens gathered inside the hangar. Volunteers, veterans, pilots, mechanics, neighbors, families from communities helped during rescue missions. People whose lives had been touched by the mission. A large photograph of Raymond Bishop stood near the front. Beside it sat another photograph. Atlas. The two images seemed perfectly matched, one guardian passing the mission to another. Mason stood quietly near the back while others spoke. He never liked attention. Never would. Sarah noticed. "You could stand closer." "I'm good here." She smiled. "Thought so." The ceremony remained simple. Stories, memories, gratitude. Nothing complicated. Nothing political. Just people recognizing a life well lived. Then something unexpected happened. An elderly attorney Mason barely recognized approached carrying a box. Weathered, dusty, old. "I've been looking for you." Mason frowned. The man handed over the box. This belonged to Raymond. "What is it?" The attorney smiled. "One final surprise." Curiosity spread immediately. Even Atlas lifted his head. Mason carefully opened the box. Inside sat folders, legal documents, financial records, trust agreements, pages and pages of paperwork. The attorney explained quietly. Raymond established this almost 15 years ago. Mason blinked. What is it? A trust. The room fell silent. The attorney continued. He knew the mission would eventually need funding. Mason stared at the documents. The numbers seemed impossible. Raymond had spent years quietly building a foundation designed to support the rescue center long after he was gone. Long after Mason would be gone. Generations. The old veteran had thought that far ahead. The realization left the room speechless. Sarah wiped at her eyes. Several veterans exchanged stunned glances. Even now, even after death, Raymond was still protecting the mission, still preparing for the future, still helping people. The attorney smiled. He wanted to make sure this never depended on one person. Mason looked around the room. The volunteers, the veterans, the families. Atlas. Everything suddenly made sense. The mission had never belonged to Raymond. It didn't belong to Mason either. It belonged to everyone willing to continue it. Later that evening, after the visitors departed and the mountains settled into silence, Mason remained alone inside the hangar. Well, almost alone. Atlas lay beside him, as always. The setting sun poured golden light through the massive doors. Dust floated through the air. The aircraft stood quietly in the background. Ready, waiting for the next mission. Mason carried a bronze plaque toward the wall near Raymond's photograph. The plaque had arrived earlier that week. Simple, modest, exactly how Raymond would have wanted it. He mounted it carefully beneath the photograph, then stepped back. The inscription reflected the fading sunlight. No one gets left behind. For a long moment, neither Mason nor Atlas moved. The words seemed larger than the plaque itself, larger than the hangar, larger than the mission. They represented everything. The promise Raymond lived by. The promise Mason carried forward. The promise Atlas had proven again and again. Outside, the Montana mountains stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The same mountains that once felt lonely. Now they felt like home. Atlas slowly stood and walked beside Mason. The old shepherd leaned gently against his leg. Mason smiled. "You did good, partner." Atlas looked up, content, peaceful. Years ago, after returning from war, Mason believed his most important days were behind him. He thought survival was the best he could hope for. He thought purpose belonged to the past. He was wrong, because one forgotten veteran had seen something worth believing in. One loyal dog had uncovered a secret buried beneath concrete and time, and together they transformed a forgotten hangar into a movement that would save lives for generations. The last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. The hangar lights glowed warmly. The rescue center remained alive around them, not because of money, not because of fame, because of people willing to help, people willing to care, people willing to answer when others needed them. Mason looked across the hangar one final time, then toward the mountains, then toward Atlas. For the first time since returning home from war, he wasn't merely surviving. He was living. And somewhere beyond the fading sunset, the last wish of Raymond Bishop continued its journey. One rescue, one life, one act of kindness at a time. The end. If you believe loyalty, purpose, and doing the right thing still matter, comment 1. If you think too many people have forgotten those values, comment 0. In a country built by people who never quit, sometimes one person standing firm can change more lives than they ever imagined. And if stories about justice, dignity, perseverance, and second chances speak to you, consider subscribing and join us for the next story.